They said the fog came early that morning, curling over the hills like breath from something alive. The Ozark air was heavy, still, the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. Down in the hollow, a small church waited, its paint cracked, its bell long rusted into silence. Inside, a handful of people sat in wooden pews, their faces pale and distant. They were all kin, every one of them. Their eyes carried the same dull grey tint, the same blood that refused to leave the valley. At the front stood a girl in a lace dress that wasn't new. The fabric was yellowed, brittle, too large for her shoulders. She held her hands together as if afraid they'd shake. Her name was Clara Mae Boone, and she was about to marry her grandfather. The man waiting for her was Silas Boone, old enough to be her father's father. His beard was white, his skin like tree bark, his eyes almost kind, until you noticed how long they lingered on her face. To the outside world, he was a patriarch, the founder of the Boone family, the man who kept their land and their blood pure. But everyone in that room knew what purity meant to him. It meant keeping the line closed, the doors locked, and the sins buried deep under family vows. The preacher's voice trembled when he began the ceremony. He looked like a man forced to speak words he didn't believe. Clara didn't look at him. She stared past the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. When Silas took her hand, she flinched, but only for a moment. Her mother sat in the back pew, veil pulled low, lips moving soundlessly. Some said she was praying, others said she was confessing. Outside, the valley held its breath. No birds sang, even the dogs stopped barking. The air was thick with something unseen, shame maybe, or the weight of old promises. Silas spoke his vows in a voice that sounded practiced, as if he'd done this before. When it was Clara's turn, her voice broke halfway through, but the preacher nodded anyway. His hand shook as he signed the family's old ledger. There was no witness from town, no church record, only the Boone book, leather-bound and stained with time. When the ring slid onto her finger, the bell above the church gave a single metallic groan, though no one had touched it in years. A gust of wind swept through the open door, snuffing out half the candles. The room filled with the scent of wax and damp earth. Some swore they saw another figure standing beside Clara in that dim light, a young woman who looked exactly like her, eyes hollow, hair loose over her shoulders. Silas turned toward the shadow but said nothing. He only smiled, slow and proud, like a man who had claimed what was his. By the time the vows ended, the fog outside had swallowed the road. The guests rose in silence, their faces blank, their footsteps soft, as if afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the floorboards. And as the doors closed behind the new bride and groom, the wind carried a faint sound through the trees. Not laughter, not weeping, but something between the two. A sound that would haunt the valley for generations. Some said it was the bell. Others said it was the blood remembering itself, but no one dared to speak it aloud. Not then, not ever. The story of the Boone family didn't begin with Clara's wedding. It began generations before, when the first Boone men rode into the Ozark hollows and never came back out. They were said to be fleeing persecution, though no one ever agreed on what kind. Some said they'd been cast out by their church for blasphemy. Others whispered they were running from the law. What's certain is that they found a valley so remote it felt like time forgot it, a place where the fog never lifted and the air smelled of iron and pine. There they built their own kingdom, a patch of cabins and fences stitched into the mountainside, and they made a rule that would define them for centuries. No outsiders. Ever. They called it keeping the blood sacred. To them it wasn't wickedness, it was devotion. They believed the world beyond the hills was impure, that God had chosen them to preserve what others had lost. Every marriage was arranged between cousins, every child baptized in a creek that ran red in the spring rains. They lived by their own scripture, a mix of the Bible and something older, something written in their own hand, filled with verses no one else had heard before. The first strange births came after the second generation. Children with mismatched eyes, silver flecks in their skin, tongues that split when they cried. But the family didn't hide them. They called these signs proof of divine favor, calling the children mirror-born, chosen to reflect God's true image. The mothers were praised, the fathers proud. To anyone who questioned it, Silas Boone's great-grandfather would smile and say, "The Lord corrects his image through us." Outsiders tried to intervene over the years, traveling preachers, doctors, census men, but none stayed long. One preacher from Little Rock came in 1879, determined to save their souls. He preached for 3 nights straight in the clearing, voice shaking, warning them that their purity was nothing but rot, wrapped in faith. On the 4th night, he vanished. His horse was found wandering near the creek, rein snapped, saddle empty. A week later, his Bible was discovered nailed shut beside the Boone house door, every page fused together by pitch. The Boones took it as a sign. They told their children, "Even the word knows when to keep quiet." Years passed, and the family grew inward like roots curling around themselves. No one went to town unless they had to. They buried their dead in unmarked graves and named their newborns after the same 6 ancestors. The valley became their world, and in that small world madness began to look like order. Their crops thrived in poor soil, their livestock never sickened. Locals began calling them blessed, but always from a distance. They would see figures watching from the tree line, pale faces, slow movements, and hurry home before dusk. By the time Clara was born, no one in the nearby towns remembered how long the Boones had lived there. Some said the family had simply folded into the earth, becoming part of the land itself. Others believed their prayers had been answered, that they had indeed made themselves sacred, though not in any way heaven would recognize. And on quiet nights, when the wind rolled through the hollows, people swore they could still hear faint singing rising from the Boone Valley. Not hymns. Something older, slower, almost human. Almost. The day Clara Mae Boone married Silas Boone, the sky turned the color of ash. The valley seemed to sink into itself, quiet and waiting, as if the earth knew what was about to happen. No bells rang. No carriages arrived. Only the sound of boots on wet soil and the faint creak of wagon wheels carrying guests who shared the same last name. From the ridge above, a few townsfolk watched, unable to look away. They said the Boone house smoked like a church on fire, white wisps rising from the chimneys as if the building itself were exhaling souls. Inside, the rooms glowed with candlelight that didn't flicker. Each flame stood perfectly still, like it was trapped in air too heavy to move. The furniture had been pushed aside to make space for a circle drawn on the floor in chalk. At its center stood Silas, tall and still, his silver hair tied back with a ribbon. His black coat hung loose over his frame, and his skin had that strange Boone pallor, half alive, half remembered. When Clara entered, no one spoke. The lace of her dress dragged against the floor, stirring up dust older than her. Those who dared to peek through the windows swore they saw 2 brides for a moment, Clara in her gown and another figure behind her wearing the same veil, the same shape of face. It was said that Silas's first wife, his daughter Mary Ellen, had been buried in that very dress 30 years before. Her grave, some claimed, had never truly stayed closed. Clara's resemblance was uncanny. Even Silas, standing there in the candlelight, looked for a heartbeat, like a man seeing a ghost and calling it home. When the vows began, thunder rolled across the sky, though not a single drop of rain fell. The preacher was gone by then. No one knew what became of him after the first ceremony months before. So Silas spoke the words himself, reading from a book bound in dark leather, its pages covered in looping handwriting, the Boone Ledger. He called it the True Blood Record. As he spoke, each family member placed a hand over their heart and whispered the same phrase, something old and foreign, carried down through generations. When Clara said her vow, her voice was almost a whisper, but the sound carried, echoing through the valley like a cry that couldn't be undone. Outside, the livestock began to stir. Horses kicked at their stalls, dogs howled in unison, and the cattle bellowed until the sound became unbearable. The witnesses on the hill backed away, some crossing themselves, others just running. One woman claimed she saw the windows glowing red, as though the walls were lined with fire from within. When morning came, the smoke was gone, and the Boone homestead stood silent once more. The few neighbors who returned found the ground around the house covered in strange prints, bare feet, all the same size, circling the property. The doors were shut, the curtains drawn, and from inside came the faint sound of humming. Clara's voice, they said, soft and tuneless, repeating one line over and over. No one ever understood the words. After that night, families began leaving the valley. They packed their wagons and didn't look back. The Boones were left alone again, just as they preferred, and in the years that followed, the old stories began to fade, except one. The tale of the wedding that should never have happened, and the bride who never truly left the altar. After the wedding, Clara Mae Boone vanished from sight. No one saw her at the markets again. Not by the well, not at church. The Boones had always kept to themselves, but this time the silence felt different, thicker, deliberate. The valley grew uneasy, as if the land itself was waiting for something it didn't want to come. At night, faint lamplight could be seen from the upper windows of the Boone house, flickering like a pulse. Sometimes, people walking home late claimed they heard crying carried on the wind, soft and rhythmic, like a child being rocked to sleep by someone who didn't know how. By the following spring, rumors began. Some said Clara had given birth. Others said she'd died in labor and been replaced by her own likeness. But when two new voices were heard from within the house, one high, one lower, the whispers turned to fear. No midwife had been called. No doctor had crossed the threshold. Yet the sounds of babies echoed faintly from behind those shuttered walls. When the taxmen came that summer, they found the house changed. The paint had peeled to grey, the garden gone wild, the air heavy with mildew and something sharper, almost metallic. Inside, the room smelled of wax and damp linen. Clara didn't come to greet them. Silas did, smiling too wide, his hands clasped behind his back. He spoke politely, but his voice carried a strange echo, as though the walls were answering him. One of the men swore he saw movement upstairs, a flash of white at the curtain. When he looked again, a face was pressed against the glass, a child's face pale as paper, eyes wide and bright, reflecting light like mirrors. There were more of them inside, though no one could tell how many, small figures that lingered in doorways, silent, unmoving. Their skin had a sickly glow under the dim lamps, and none seemed to blink. One boy, older than the rest, stood near the window with both hands flat on the glass. His eyes, grey, flecked with silver, were identical to both Clara's and Silas's. When the taxmen left, they did not speak to each other for miles, afraid the words would turn to something else on their tongues. The town doctor was sent a week later. He returned the same day, carrying his bag close to his chest. No one could get a word from him. That night, a fire burned behind his house. By morning, only ashes remained, his journals, his instruments, and a single pair of melted spectacles. He left town by dusk and was never seen again. Then came the sickness. At first it was small, cattle miscarried, crops withered in perfect circles, but soon babies were born in nearby farms with eyes that glimmered like glass. Their parents swore they had no Boone blood, but the midwives whispered otherwise. Some infants didn't cry at all, they only watched, and as months passed, their reflections began to move a heartbeat slower than they did. By winter, people stopped speaking the Boone name. They sealed their wells, burned their barns, and prayed to any god that would listen. But the air still carried that same lullaby from the hollow, a low, endless hum, sung by voices that should never have existed at all. By the 1940s, the world had changed, but the Boone Valley hadn't. It remained a place left off most maps, shrouded in fog and superstition. When government surveyors arrived to chart the Ozarks, they expected old farms and broken fences, not the silence that waited for them there. The road into the hollow was barely a path, swallowed by moss and roots. The first team that ventured in kept notes on everything: elevation, rock layers, soil composition. But somewhere between the figures and maps, their records began to read like confessions. One file among them was marked Case 47B, Boone Anomaly. The team found the Boone property still standing, though no smoke rose from its chimneys. The air was heavy with damp rot, and the trees seemed to grow inward toward the house, like the forest itself was trying to reclaim what it had once rejected. Behind the house was a graveyard, small, fenced with rusted iron, and filled with headstones repeating the same few names: Silas Boone, Clara Boone, Silas Boone Jr., Clara Mae Boone. The pattern stretched on, century after century. On the few remaining tin photographs nailed to the crosses, the faces looked nearly identical. Same eyes, same mouth, same expression, as if time had simply folded back on itself and made copies. When one of the men took a photograph, the flash reflected oddly, too bright, too sharp. The image developed faintly doubled, showing each figure twice, side by side, one solid and one transparent. They tried again, but every photo came out the same: two images, always touching. The files say the team found something else too: a cellar door buried beneath weeds. Inside they discovered a series of limestone tunnels, carved with precision that no farmer could have managed alone. The air below was cold and stale, and the deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to pulse with moisture. In the lowest chamber, they found shelves of old ledgers, stacked and sealed in wax. The books were filled with names, dates, and drawings of family trees that looped back into themselves. The handwriting was identical across every century, each line written by a hand that never seemed to age. The official report ended abruptly, its last page torn. But decades later, scientists revisiting the file tried to analyze DNA samples taken from bone fragments collected at the site. The results made no sense. Genetic mapping showed endless repetition, strands folding over themselves, replicating, merging. No outside markers, no variation. As if the entire Boone bloodline had become a perfect circle, eating its own tail. One researcher called it closed heredity. Another called it proof of human recycling. Locals had their own name for it. They said the Boones didn't die, they simply remade themselves using their own flesh as scripture. Birth and death were the same doorway, opened again and again until the house itself could no longer tell the difference between the living and the remembered. Even now, when heavy rain falls in that valley, the ground softens around the graves. Mud seeps up through the cracks, and beneath it, faint outlines shift, not bones, but shapes still forming. Some say it's just the water rising, others say it's the family, waiting for the next turn of their blood to begin again. The Boone estate is nothing now but bones beneath the trees. What used to be a home has become a scar in the landscape, its walls buried under moss, its roof caved in long ago. The forest has swallowed it whole. Travelers who pass through the Ozark backroads say the air changes when they near the old property, colder, heavier, like it carries a memory. Even the birds go silent. The path that once led to the Boone house is nearly gone, overgrown with wild ivy and black roots that twist like veins. Yet some still find their way there, drawn by stories they don't believe until they see it for themselves. At the edge of the clearing stands what remains of the foundation, stone blocks slick with rain and time. In the center, half buried beneath years of leaves, lies the cellar door. It's warped and rotted, but sometimes it moves, not with the wind, but with rhythm, a slow rise and fall, as though something beneath it breathes. People who ventured close say they've heard humming. Not a song exactly, just a low, steady sound that carries through the trees. And if you listen long enough, it starts to form words that never quite finish. In 2018, a small forensic team from the University of Missouri came to the site as part of a historical excavation. They thought they were documenting folklore. What they found changed that. Deep in the soil, near the remains of the cellar, they discovered traces of blood soaked into the stone. Tests showed it didn't match any known lineage. The structure of the DNA itself was irregular, too repetitive, looping back on itself the way the old Boone records described. Alongside it, they found a ring, silver and delicate, engraved with the letters CMB. The metal hadn't tarnished. The inscription was as clear as the day it was carved. One of the researchers took a photograph of the find. In the image, the ring rests on a gloved palm, but behind it, faintly, a figure stands by the cellar door. A woman in a tattered veil, her face blurred, her outline too bright against the darkness. They dismissed it as lens flare, though the photographer insisted she'd seen someone standing there before the flash. She described her as small, still, almost waiting. Locals say the spirit of Clara Mae Boone never left that valley. Some believe she waits for Silas, her husband, her grandfather, the man who bound her to both love and blood. Others say she became part of the land itself, her voice the wind, her breath the fog that rises every spring. On moonless nights, when the air is thick and the ground slick with dew, you can hear her steps along the old stones, soft and measured. And if you call her name, the forest answers back in a whisper that sounds almost like your own. The valley doesn't welcome visitors anymore. It watches them. Every tree leans inward. Every shadow seems to listen. And somewhere beneath the soil, the family still lies together, generation folded into generation, breath mingled with breath. Those who have stayed long enough swear the ground moves beneath their feet, not from wind or quake, but from something deeper, something alive. As if the Boone blood still stirs, remembering its shape. And somewhere in that endless silence, the bride still waits.